The autumn wind drifted low over the valley, carrying with it the smell of wood smoke and damp earth. In that small American village, tucked between endless fields and the slow bend of the river, life moved at a pace that felt older than the century itself. Horses clattered over uneven cobblestones. Children darted between clapboard houses with laughter trailing behind them. And church bells marked the hours in tones that seemed to settle into every roof and window pane. It was the late 1800s, a time when fortunes were made by those with sprawling acres or deep pockets, and the poor often bent under the weight of both pride and hunger. In such a place, stories were not just whispered, they were lived out in plain sight. And it was in this village that a young woman found herself at the center of one of the cruelest tales the townsfolk had ever chosen to tell. She was known for her quiet strength. She worked in her father's small shop, her hands stained with ink from the ledger she kept and flour from the bread she kneaded each morning. There was nothing extraordinary about her by the world's measure. She had no dowry, no jewels, and no grand home to show for her family's name. Yet there was a brightness in her eyes, a stillness in her step that drew attention whether she wished for it or not. And in a village where wealth commanded respect, attention from the wrong man could become a curse. The wealthy merchant who fancied her was not a man easily denied. He was used to taking what he wanted, with gold in his pocket and a voice that could silence a room. His suits were tailored from the city. His boots shined so that the dusty road never seemed to cling to him. To many, he was a prize, the kind of husband who could lift a family out of obscurity. Mothers whispered to their daughters that such a man was a blessing, though some in the village knew of the bitterness in his smile and the sharpness in his temper. Still, when his eye fell on the shopkeeper's daughter, the expectation was clear. She would say yes, but she did not. With quiet words, she refused him. It was not dramatic, not loud, not meant to shame, but in a village where people measured worth by how close one stood to wealth, her refusal spread like wildfire. She turned him down. The gossips sneered on their porches. Thinks herself too fine, does she? The merchant, stung and humiliated, fanned those whispers into flames. Soon, laughter followed her in the streets. Children mocked her walk, boys jeered at her simplicity, and even women who once greeted her with warmth turned their heads as she passed. She became a figure of ridicule, the girl who dared refuse a rich man. Nights grew heavy for her. She sat by the lamp in the quiet of her room, her father asleep in the next, and wondered if she had made a mistake. Yet in her heart, she knew she could not bind herself to a man she did not trust, no matter what fortune he promised. Still, conviction was a lonely companion in a village that prized silver over sincerity. Each Sunday at church, she felt the weight of eyes upon her, eyes that once softened in kindness but now hardened with judgment. It was in those same pews that another figure watched her with quiet persistence. He was a farmer, and unlike the merchant, his boots bore the dirt of long days, his hands rough with work, the land never finished giving. His clothes were patched, his hat sun-worn, and his fortune was little more than the crop he could coax from stubborn soil. To most, he was invisible, another laborer who lived on the edge of the village with little to his name. But to him, she was not invisible. He had watched how she carried her burdens with dignity, how her voice never rose, in spite of the mockery that followed her. He had seen her gather bread for children, not her own, and pause to tie in neighbors' horseware. Others would walk past. Still, he hesitated. What could he offer her? He had no carriage to shield her from the whispers, no gold to quiet the jeers. He had only his word, his hands, and the belief that a heart might matter more than wealth. Yet belief is not always enough in a world where pride is bruised, and the rich man had not forgotten the sting of her rejection. His insults grew sharper, his influence stretching long across the village, until even her father's small shop began to feel the weight of it. Customers turned away, fearful of being on the wrong side of the merchant's displeasure. Each passing day, it seemed her world shrank smaller, pressing her into corners where hope grew dim. The farmer could bear watching no longer. One evening, when the sky burned red with the setting sun and the village settled into the hush of night, he stepped into the narrow street that led to her home. His heart pounded like a drum, yet his stride was steady. Somewhere deep within, he knew the risk knew that standing by her side meant not only defying the richest man in town, but also inviting scorn upon himself. Still, something in him would not be silent. He had seen enough of how wealth could blind a village, and enough of how courage could shine in a single soul. As he neared her door, the laughter of men echoed down the lane, cruel voices mocking. The girl who had dared to refuse what most would have clawed to accept. The farmer tightened his grip on the brim of his hat, his jaw set firm. The door creaked open, her figure framed by lamplight, her eyes tired but unbroken. For the first time, she saw him not as the quiet man from the fields, but as someone who had chosen to step forward when all others turned away. The air seemed to thicken between them, the voices of the village spilling around like a tide. What he would say next, what she would answer, could change everything. But just as he opened his mouth, footsteps thundered closer, heavy with anger. And the shadow of the merchant stretched long across the cobblestones. And in that moment, the village seemed to hold its breath. The merchant's shadow seemed to stretch farther than the lamplight should have allowed, as though the whole street bent under his presence. His boots struck the ground with a certainty that belonged to men who had never known refusal. Behind him, two of his companions followed, men eager to share in his power. Men who laughed when he laughed and sneered when he sneered. Their voices cut through the quiet, mocking, taunting, as though the night itself belonged to them. The young woman at the door did not move. Her hands gripped the wooden frame, her knuckles white, but her chin did not lower. The farmer shifted slightly, placing himself a step forward, though he had no plan other than to be a barrier between her and the weight of the merchant's scorn. The merchant halted, his fine coat catching the flicker of the lanterns. His eyes, sharp and cold, moved first to her, then to the man standing in front of her door. A smirk curled across his face, the kind that carried no humor at all. "So this is how it is," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You would rather keep company with a beggar from the fields than accept the hand I offered." His companions chuckled, each echo feeding the cruel tone of the moment. The woman said nothing, but her silence seemed louder than words. It was a silence that told the truth more clearly than any protest could have. The farmer, however, felt heat rise in his chest. His voice was steady, though softer than the merchant's. As he answered, "She owes no man her hand, least of all one who would force it." The words fell heavy, and the laughter died in the throats of the men behind the merchant. No one spoke to him like that, not in this village. Not without paying a price. The merchant's jaw tightened, though his smile remained. He stepped closer, his polished boots crunching against the grit of the road. "You think you can stand between me and what I choose?" he asked. His tone was quiet now, but the quiet was more dangerous than a shout. "Do you know what becomes of those who set themselves against me?" The farmer met his gaze, though inside he felt the tremor of his own fear. He knew he had little no land of wealth, no family of name, no voice in the ears of the powerful. But he also knew the look in the woman's eyes, the tired strength of someone who had stood alone too long. The moment stretched, till one of the merchant's companions let out a mocking laugh to break the silence. "Come away," the man urged. "This fool isn't worth the dirt on your boots." Yet the merchant did not move. He let his gaze linger, first on the woman, then on the farmer, before finally stepping back. His smile returned, thin and sharp. "Very well," he said, adjusting his coat as though brushing away the insult. "If this is the company you prefer, so be it. But understand this, no one defies me without cost. The both of you will learn that before long." With that, he turned, his men following with low laughter that carried down the street until the night swallowed it whole. The door shut softly behind them. But the silence that followed was not peace. It was the heavy quiet of dread, the kind that clings to walls and waits in corners. Inside, the lamplight flickered, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floor. The farmer stood awkwardly in the small room, hat twisting in his hands. He had not meant to intrude, had not planned to stand at her side with words that could only invite more trouble. He could not walk away. She offered him a chair by the table, her voice faint from exhaustion, but touched with gratitude. He sat, though uneasy, aware of how small and bare the room was. Shelves lined with jars, a modest fire, and the faint smell of bread still hung in the air. It was not wealth, but it was warmth. The farmer spoke little, unsure what to say, and she, too, was quiet, though the weight of unspoken fears filled the space between them. Outside, the village seemed still, but both knew whispers would grow by morning. The days that followed only proved the merchant's promise. Customers who once visited her father's shop now crossed the street to avoid it. Suppliers who had been reliable for years suddenly claimed they could no longer provide. The merchant's shadow reached farther than her door. It touched her family's livelihood, pressing harder each day. Her father, weary and troubled, spoke in hushed tones of debts and dwindling stock. "Perhaps," he whispered one evening, "you should not have refused him." The words cut deeper than the laughter of the village, for they came from the man she loved most. She answered with quiet resolve, though her heart trembled. "I could not do otherwise." The farmer watched from a distance, his own life bound to the soil. His fields gave him little, but enough to survive, and the hours bent his back until the sun fell behind the hills. Yet each evening he found himself near the village, near her shop, as though drawn by something beyond reason. He saw the strain in her face, the weight she carried with grace, and though he felt powerless, he could not turn away. Meanwhile, the merchant's grip on the village tightened. He extended credit to some, withdrew it from others, all while ensuring his name was spoken with both fear and respect. His wealth bought silence, his anger brought obedience. Only she had refused him, and only the farmer had dared to stand in his path. Their defiance burned in his pride like a coal that would not cool. Rumors began to spread, rumors planted, no doubt by the merchant himself. Whispers that the shopkeeper's daughter had been foolish, that she sought attention, that she fancied herself above her station. Some claimed she was already secretly tied to the penniless farmer, that her rejection of the merchant was a game. These tales, cruel and false, spread through porches and taverns, until truth became harder to hold on to. The farmer, too, was mocked in hushed tones, his name spoken with laughter whenever he passed through town. But ridicule could not silence him, not when he saw the toll it took on her spirit. One evening, as autumn deepened and the chill of winter pressed closer, the farmer returned to his small cabin at the edge of the fields. The fire was weak, the roof leaked when it rained, and the cupboard held little more than potatoes and dried beans, yet his mind was not on hunger. He sat at the table, staring at his hands that bore the calluses of labor. Hands that could build, could mend, but could not shield her from the cruelty of the wealthy. The question haunted him. What could a man with nothing offer? Woman who deserved everything. In the village, her struggle grew sharper. Each day was a battle against scorn. Each night a prayer that her father's shop would survive another week. Still, she carried herself with a dignity that confounded those who tried to tear her down. And perhaps it was that very dignity that drew the farmer closer still. though he had yet to find the courage to speak what was in his heart. The merchant, however, had not forgotten his threat. He began to move in quieter ways now, whispers and plots that reached into places unseen. His anger had not cooled. It had only sharpened, waiting for the moment to strike where it would wound the most. The village itself seemed to watch and wait, as though it knew something larger loomed, though no one dared speak of it aloud. And so the days turned colder, the nights longer, and in the space between, lives intertwined in ways no one could have predicted. The shopkeeper's daughter, the penniless farmer, the merchant whose pride had been cut, were bound in a story that would test the very soul of the village. And though no one could yet see it, the choice each would make would ripple far beyond the narrow, cobbled streets, shaping fates in ways that none could undo. The farmer rose before dawn one morning, the frost still clinging to the earth, and began the long walk toward the village. His steps were heavy, not from weariness, but from the weight of what he meant to do. He had no plan, no promise of success, only the resolve that silence was no longer enough. As he drew closer, the first light touched the rooftops, and the smoke of early fires curled into the sky. Somewhere ahead, in the heart of that village, waited both the woman he could not forget and the man whose shadow threatened them both. The path narrowed, the air cold against his skin, but he did not slow. For deep within, he knew the moment was coming when everything would be forced into the open. And when it came, no one, neither the mocked nor the mighty, would leave unchanged. The frost had hardened the earth by the time the farmer reached the village, his breath rising in faint clouds that drifted into the pale morning air. The street was quiet, only a few shopkeepers lifting shutters and sweeping away the night's dust. Yet beneath that calm lay an unease, as if the town itself held its breath. The merchant's name lingered everywhere, in whispered warnings, in debts left unpaid, in favors granted with the weight of chains. And at the center of all the murmurs was still the girl who had dared to refuse him, and the man who had dared to stand at her side. The farmer walked past the blacksmith shop, past the tavern where men gathered in the evenings to trade news, and past the church whose bell tower stood like a sentinel over the village. He felt the eyes of a few who glanced his way, not with greeting, but with the quiet curiosity reserved for those who had stepped outside the safe lines of silence. Some even looked away quickly, as though fear alone could shield them from association. He said nothing, only adjusted the brim of his hat and continued toward the small shop at the end of the lane. Inside, the girl was already at work. Shelves were half empty, the smell of stale flour lingering where fresh bread once filled the air. Her father sat behind the counter, shoulders bent, his face marked with worry. When the farmer entered, a faint smile flickered across her lips, though her eyes betrayed the strain she carried. Her father, however, offered no greeting. He looked at the farmer with suspicion, perhaps even resentment. To him, this man from the fields had done nothing but draw more attention, more danger upon his already fragile household. The farmer bought a small loaf, though he knew the price was higher than he could afford. He lingered, unsure of his words, until finally he said quietly, "You don't have to face this alone." The girl's father bristled, his voice sharp despite his age. "And what will you do, boy? Put food on the shelves. Keep the merchant's men from turning away customers. Words don't feed us, and they don't mend the damage already done." The farmer lowered his eyes, accepting the sting without protest. Yet when he looked back at the girl, he saw in her gaze that she understood that though he had little, he offered what no one else dared to give: solidarity. Still, solidarity did not fill an empty shop. By afternoon, the whispers had grown into louder tones. A group of women gathered outside, their baskets hooked over their arms, their voices rising in a mix of pity and ridicule. "It's a shame," one said. "A girl could have lifted her family into comfort, but pride doesn't fill bellies. Another shook her head, adding, "She thinks herself better than the rest of us," refusing what we would have given anything. 4. Their words reached the girl where she stood inside, her hands gripping the counter until her knuckles burned. The farmer, lingering nearby, heard it too. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing, for to confront them would only make matters worse. As the days passed, the conflict deepened, touching corners of the village that had once seemed untouched. The blacksmith, who owed the merchant for his tools, quietly refused to sharpen the farmer's plow. The miller, whose grain was tied to the merchant's wagons, began shorting the flour he sent to the shop. Even the preacher, a man who spoke often of forgiveness, seemed careful with his words on Sunday, cautioning against defiance that breeds discord. The farmer and the girl became symbols of resistance, though neither had sought such a place. And in a town ruled by wealth and fear, symbols were dangerous things. One evening, as dusk settled and the streets emptied, the farmer crossed paths with an older woman who lived near the edge of the fields. She was poor like him, her cottage leaning, her roof patched with scrap wood. Yet she met him with a knowing look, her voice low. "You've stirred something you don't yet understand," she said. "The merchant doesn't just trade in goods, he trades in fear. He'll break you if it proves his power." The farmer nodded, though he offered no reply. Her words echoed in his mind long after he walked away. Meanwhile, the merchant wove his own threads in the shadows. He was not content merely to see their shop fail. Pride demanded more. He began inviting influential men to his home, dinners where he poured fine wine and spoke in quiet tones of loyalty, respect, and punishment. He painted the farmer as a threat to order, a fool who would spread defiance if not checked. He painted the girl as arrogant, a danger to tradition, a reminder of what happened when people forgot their place. His listeners, tied to him by debt or ambition, nodded along. The net drew tighter, unseen but deadly. Yet even in the midst of this darkness, small subplots unfolded, threads of life that carried both hope and pain. The farmer's younger brother, a boy barely in his teens, began sneaking into the village to watch. He admired his brother's quiet courage, though he could not understand the weight it carried. In secret, he told friends at the mill about how his brother stood up to the merchant, how he faced scorn without backing down. Among the youth, whispers of admiration began to grow, though hidden from their parents. They saw in the farmer not just a poor man, but a figure of defiance, proof that one could stand against wealth. At the same time, the girl's father wrestled with his own torment. He loved his daughter, but each empty shelf, each day without customers, cut at him. He began to wonder if her choice had doomed them both. At night, he sat by the dying fire, thinking of his wife long gone, wondering what advice she would have given. He was not a cruel man, but desperation made him sharp, and sometimes he let words slip that he regretted the moment they left his mouth. The girl bore them with quiet strength, though each one weighed heavy upon her heart. The tavern, too, became a stage for the growing conflict. Men who worked the fields and wagons gathered each night, their voices lowered as they spoke of the merchant's reach. Some pitied the farmer, some mocked him, but all agreed that standing against the merchant was folly. Yet within those walls, new rumors also brewed, rumors that the merchant planned something more than whispers, something that would make an example of both the girl and the man who dared stand with her. No one spoke details, but the unease grew, spreading like smoke through every corner of the village. Through it all, the farmer's resolve only deepened. He tended his fields by day, though his mind rarely left the girl's plight, and by evening, he walked the lane to her shop. They spoke little at first, their words weighted with unspoken fears. But over time, they shared more small memories, quiet laughter, fragments of lives that felt almost normal. Those moments, though brief, lit sparks of hope that defied the darkness pressing around them. Still, hope was fragile. One night, as the farmer walked home along the dirt road, he heard footsteps behind him. At first faint, then louder. He turned, but the shadows gave nothing away. The sound quickened, and before he could react, a stone struck the ground near his feet. Laughter followed, harsh and cruel. He could not see faces, only the shapes of men hidden beyond the reach of moonlight. "Best stay out of what isn't." "Yours," one voice hissed before the shadows dissolved into silence. The farmer stood alone on the road. The stone at his feet, a reminder of the warning. The tension pressed tighter with each passing day. The girl felt it in the thinning shelves, her father in the dwindling coins, the farmer in the growing hostility of neighbors. Even the children sensed it, their games interrupted by sudden silences when the merchant's name was spoken. Conflict was no longer just about pride or a proposal refused, had become a struggle that reached into the bones of the village itself, and though the winter crept closer, bringing the promise of hardship and hunger, a greater storm was building. The merchant was patient, but his pride demanded a reckoning. The girl, though weary, refused to bend. The farmer, though poor, refused to step aside. And the village, caught between fear and admiration, could only wait for the moment when words and whispers would no longer suffice, when action sharp, brutal and inescapable would fall like the weight of the frozen sky. For now, the conflict churned beneath the surface, a fire smoldering in silence. But all could feel its sense that the quiet would not last, that something inevitable loomed, something that would decide not only the fate of a girl and a farmer, but the very soul of the village itself. Snow came early that year, soft at first, dusting the rooftops and fields, but soon heavy enough to weigh down fences and bury the narrow paths between the cottages. The village seemed quieter under the white blanket. Though the silence was not precise, was the silence of something waiting to break. Smoke curled from chimneys, lamps glowed behind frosted windows, and yet behind every door whispers of the merchant's next move hung in the air. No one doubted that he would strike. The only question was when and how. The girl rose earlier each morning, stoking the fire and baking what little bread she could manage with the flour left in her father's storehouse. Customers had grown scarce, yet she kept the shelves in order, determined that the place would not fall into ruin under her care. Her father grew more withdrawn, shoulders bent with worry, his voice short when he spoke at all. He had once been a man of steady faith, but now he looked at the ledgers with despair in his eyes, each empty line a reminder of how quickly fortune could vanish. Still, the girl held herself with dignity, though her hands trembled sometimes when she thought no one was watching. The farmer continued to come by in the evenings, brushing the snow from his coat before stepping into the warmth of the shop. He brought small things from his field turnips, apples stored in straw, sometimes a rabbit he had trapped in the woods. They were gifts worth little to most, but to her they meant survival. Her father accepted them reluctantly, though pride made him cold toward the man who gave them. The farmer did not take offense. He understood. What weighed on him most was not the harsh words, but the knowledge that he had so little to offer against. The storm they faced, the village's eyes remained sharp. Each time the farmer lingered near her door, each time she accepted his offerings, whispers rippled through the streets. "He's courting her," some said. "What good is a man who can't even feed himself?" Others were harsher, claiming she clung to him out of stubbornness, refusing to admit her folly in turning down the merchant. These words reached their ears, though never spoken to their faces, and each one cut like a knife. Still, they walked with heads unbowed, though the burden grew heavier. The merchant, for his part, played the game with precision. He never raised his voice in public, never dirtied his hands with open threats. Instead, he moved in shadows, twisting debts tighter around families, spreading rumors in quiet corners. His wealth bought loyalty. His pride demanded obedience. Yet, beneath his calm smile, simmered a rage that had not cooled since the night she refused him. He wanted more than her hand now. He wanted her ruined, her dignity shattered, her very name turned into a lesson for anyone else who dared stand against him. It was at the tavern one bitter evening that whispers of his plan began to surface. A traveling peddler, drunk with ale, spoke too freely of a conversation he had overheard near the merchant's estate. "Mark my words," he slurred to the men around him. "There'll be no peace for that shopgirl or the farmer who follows her like a dog. The merchant's tired of games. He means to end it once and for all." His words, though clouded by drink, spread quickly through the village, and by morning they had reached the girl's ears. She said nothing, but the color drained from her face, and the farmer, seeing her fear, felt the weight of decision pressing upon him more than ever. Snowstorms swept through the valley, cutting the village off for days at a time. Roads disappeared. Wagons halted and families huddled close to their fires. Hunger pressed harder, and in such times people clung tighter to those with means. The merchant thrived in this hardship, his storehouses full, his wagons still moving under heavy guard. He handed out food in measured portions, ensuring that each mouth fed was another debt owed. Gratitude turned into chains, and the village bent lower beneath his power. Yet not all bent willingly. Among the younger men, particularly those who labored in the fields, a quiet unrest stirred. They saw how the merchant grew fat, while others starved, how he crushed anyone who stood in his way. Around their fires, they spoke of the farmer who had defied him, of the girl who had endured humiliation rather than submit. These small conversations, though hidden, carried sparks of defiance that the merchant could not see. The farmer himself remained unaware of how many eyes now looked to him, though he felt the shift in the air, a sense that the village's fate was tied to his in ways he had not asked for. The girl, too, felt the strain of being watched. Each step outside her door brought stares, some filled with pity, others with scorn. She carried herself as best she could, but nights were long, and in the quiet she allowed herself tears she would never shed in daylight. Her father pressed her harder now, speaking often of what they had lost, sometimes even suggesting she swallow her pride and beg the merchant's pardon. The thought turned her stomach, but she listened in silence, unwilling to wound him further. By refusing outright, yet deep in her heart, she knew she could never bow to a man who sought to break her spirit. The farmer, seeing her weariness grow, began to dream of escape. He thought of leaving the village behind, of finding some distant town where the merchant's name carried no weight, where they might build something with their own hands. But dreams were fragile things, easily crushed by the harshness of reality. He had no money for such a journey, no land to sell, no horse strong enough for long travel. They were bound to the soil of this valley, whether they wished it or not. And so he stayed, waiting for the storm he knew was coming. That storm arrived one night, though not with thunder or snow. It came in the form of footsteps outside the shop, the sound of men gathering, their voices low but filled with purpose. The girl was alone with her father when she heard them, her heart seizing as shadows moved past the window. Her father rose, his face pale, but before he could reach the door, it burst open. The cold wind sweeping in, along with three men whose faces were hidden beneath heavy cloaks. They said nothing at first, only stepped inside, their presence filling the small room with menace. The farmer, by chance, was near the edge of the village when he saw the light spill from the open doorway. Something in him tightened, and without thought, he ran toward it, his boots slipping on the ice as he crossed the street. He reached the threshold just as one of the men inside turned. revealing beneath his hood the sharp smile of one of the merchant's closest companions. The sight confirmed what he already knew. This was no random intrusion. This was the beginning of the end the merchant had promised. He stepped inside, his voice steady, though his heart thundered. "Leave them," he said, standing between the intruders and the girl. The men laughed, a harsh sound that carried no warmth. "You should have stayed in your fields," one sneered. "This isn't your fight." But it was his fight, and he knew it. Not just for her, but for every cruel word, every mocking laugh. Every shadow of fear that had hung over the village since the merchant's pride was wounded. The standoff held for only a moment, but it felt longer, the air thick with tension. The girl clutched her father's arm, her eyes wide, her breath quick. The farmer's fists clenched, his body ready, though his strength was little compared to theirs. Outside, the snow fell silently, muffling the world as though nature itself held back to see what would unfold. The men stepped closer, their intentions clear, and in that instant, the village's quiet conflict teetered on the edge of something far more dangerous. The farmer stood unflinching, though his heart pounded like a drum. The girl's father tried to speak, but his voice failed him, lost in fear. And just as the first of the men reached for the farmer, the sound of boots striking the frozen ground. Outside grew louder, closer, until the entire street echoed with it. More figures approach, shadows carrying lanterns, voices rising in the night. The village was stirring, drawn by the commotion, uncertain whether to aid or to condemn, but unable to remain hidden any longer. Windows opened, doors cracked, faces appeared in the glow of firelight. The struggle that had simmered for months was finally erupting, no longer confined to whispers and sidelong glances. And as the merchant himself appeared at the far end of the street, his coat dark against the snow, his presence towering over all others, the air in the village shifted. This was no longer about a shopgirl or a penniless farmer. It was about power, about pride, about whether one man's wealth could hold an entire town in chains. Every step he took toward the shop tightened the tension. Every flicker of the lanterns casting his shadow longer across the frozen ground. The girl, the farmer, the villagers watching from their windows felt it at once. The moment had come when silence would no longer shield them, when choices would be forced. And the future of more than 2 lives would hang in the balance. The snow fell heavier, the lanterns burned brighter, and the night trembled on the edge of something that could not be undone. The merchant's boots struck hard against the frozen ground as he drew nearer, his dark coat whipping in the winter wind. Every step seemed to stretch the shadow of his power across the street. Yet for the first time, the villagers did not shrink back entirely. Faces lingered in the glow of lanterns, eyes wide and uncertain, but unwilling to hide. The girl clutched her father's arm, steadying him, though her own knees trembled. The farmer stood tall, though his fists were tight and his breath short, as if the weight of every choice had settled on his shoulders in that moment. The merchant stopped just outside the doorway, his gaze sweeping over the small shop that had become the center of his wounded pride. His eyes locked on the farmer first, then the girl, then on the gathering of villagers whose whispers cut through the silence. He raised his chin, his voice loud enough to carry across the street. "You all see it," he said, his tone sharp as ice. "You see how defiance breeds ruin. This man and this girl dare to mock me, and in their pride they have dragged you into their downfall. Tonight you will learn what happens to those who forget their place." The men he had sent ahead tightened, their grip ready to strike, but the sound of murmuring spread through the crowd. It was low at first, then stronger. A woman near the back spoke clearly, her voice trembling but firm. "We have all bent long enough." Another man added, "He cannot own us all." The words rippled outward, and though fear still clung heavy, courage sparked in their eyes. The merchant's brow furrowed, his practiced smile faltering for the first time in memory. He had expected obedience, not resistance. The farmer stepped forward then, standing between the girl and the merchant. His voice was calm, though it carried a strength born of months of silent endurance. You have wealth, but you cannot buy what you've lost tonight. You cannot buy respect, nor loyalty, nor love. You've tried to break her spirit, but instead, you've shown us all what kind of man you truly are. His words struck harder than fists, for they named the truth that had long hidden in whispers. The villagers shifted. Their silence no longer fear, but solidarity. The merchant's companions looked uncertain now, glancing to one another, waiting for his command. But he saw what they saw. The village was no longer bending. His pride urged him to lash out, to prove his power through force. Yet he also knew the eyes upon him could no longer be blinded. Any violence would only confirm what the farmer had said. The moment hung heavy, and for once he found no words to wield as a weapon. With a sharp motion, he turned, his coat swirling as he strode back into the night. His men followed, though their steps lacked the certainty of before. When the last echo of boots faded into silence, the village stood still, uncertain if the storm had truly passed. Then, one by one, lanterns lifted higher, and voices broke the quiet. The older woman from the edge of the fields stepped forward first, nodding to the farmer with quiet respect. Others followed, gathering near the shop, their presence a shield stronger than any words. For the first time in months, the girl felt the weight on her chest lighten, though tears slipped down her face unchecked. Her father sat heavily in his chair, his head bowed, but when he lifted his eyes, the hardness had softened. He looked at the farmer not with resentment, but with gratitude, though no words yet passed his lips. The days that followed brought change. The merchant remained in the village, but his grip was broken. Customers who had once avoided the shop returned, some shy with apology, others bold in their support. Debts were questioned, whispers challenged, and slowly the power that had seemed unshakable began to crumble. The merchant's wagons still rolled, but no longer with the same command. Men who once bowed their heads now met his gaze. Women who once repeated his words now spoke their own. Pride had made him blind, and in the end, it had cost him what he valued most: unquestioned control. For the farmer and the girl, life did not transform overnight. The fields were still hard, the shops still modest, and winter still harsh. But what changed was the spirit in which they carried those burdens. They no longer faced them alone. Each evening when the farmer brought his small offerings, her father welcomed him, sometimes with a word, sometimes with a nod that meant more than words could hold. The girl's laughter, though still rare, returned in quiet moments, a sound that warmed even the coldest nights. The younger brother of the farmer, inspired by what he had seen, began to help more in the fields, working beside him with a pride he had not shown before. Among the youth of the village, the story spread not of wealth or power, but of courage. They repeated how a poor farmer had stood firm, how a girl had refused to bow, how a village had chosen to rise together. These stories grew with each telling, shaping a memory that even the merchant could not erase. The father of the girl, once weighed by regret, found peace in his daughter's strength. Though he still worried for the future, he no longer urged her toward what her heart rejected. Instead, he spoke of rebuilding the shop, of holding firm against whatever storms might come. At night, when the fire burned low, he thought of his late wife, and for the first time in years, he believed she would have been proud. As spring drew near and the snow melted into streams that ran through the fields, the village itself seemed renewed. The tavern no longer echoed with fear, but with plans for planting, for trade, for a future not bound by one man's pride. The church bell rang clearer, calling not to caution but to hope. The blacksmith, the miller, even the preacher began to speak differently, their voices carrying not submission but independence. It was not a perfect peace, but it was a beginning. The farmer and the girl often walked the lane together now, no longer hiding from eyes that once judged them. Their steps were steady, their silence comfortable. And though neither spoke of promises yet, both knew what the other carried in their heart. It was not wealth that bound them, nor grand gestures, but the quiet strength of having endured together. In that, they found something more lasting than gold. The merchant, though still present, grew smaller in their minds. His estate remained, his wagons still passed, but his voice no longer commanded the village. Some still feared him, but more pitied him, a man whose pride had consumed him until he was left with only shadows of the power he once held. He watched from a distance as the farmer and the girl walked side by side, and though his jaw tightened, he could do nothing. His reign of fear had ended the moment the village chose not to bow. Seasons turned, fields bloomed, and the story of what had happened that winter became part of the village itself. Parents told it to their children, not as a tale of wealth or revenge, but as a lesson that dignity cannot be bought, that pride can destroy, and that even the poorest voice can hold the strength to change many. The girl, once mocked, became a symbol of quiet courage. The farmer, once scorned, became a reminder of what true strength looks like. Together, they carried forward, not as heroes, but as people who had chosen to stand when standing was hardest. And, in the end, the village itself was changed most of all. No longer bound by one man's shadow, it had learned that power rests not in wealth or fear, but in unity. When people stand together, even the strongest merchant cannot bend them. That truth, once hidden in whispers, had been spoken aloud, and it would not be forgotten. The farmer's fields grew greener with each passing year. The shop's shelves filled once more, and laughter returned to the narrow streets. There were still hardships, still storms, still days of hunger and toil, but they were faced with different hearts now. For what mattered was no longer the weight of one man's pride, but the strength of many standing as one dot. And so the story closed not with grand triumph, but with the steady, lasting victory of human spirit, of dignity that could not be sold, of courage that could not be silenced, of a village that had learned to walk forward together. In that quiet ending lay the truest reflection of all, that the greatest wealth is found not in gold or power, but in hearts that remain unbroken.